My assignment for our meeting is to be chair and make some preliminary remarks. Preliminary remarks are an invitation to use a familiar Israeli opening line. Friends, before I talk, I would like to say a few words. So here they are. I have both the honor and the pleasure of welcoming Michael Walzer and celebrating his miraculous 90th birthday. I remember when Michael turned 40, we celebrated at Cape Cod by playing baseball on the beach. I use the term miraculous birthday advisedly. 90 years old looked to us then like Methuselah age, totally off the scale. But here we are with Michael, still going strong amidst his loving and lovely family. While we joyously celebrate Michael's birthday, we should stick this session to the grim topic of wars, a topic which is a centerpiece of Michael's work. But more importantly, it is a center of the intense interest in the morality of war which Michael revived. Rules of war are half as old as time. But it was Thomas of Aquinas, following remarks by Augustine, who systematically dealt with the Christian morality of war. Following Aquinas, it was predominantly Catholics who were preoccupied with the ethics of war. Michael Walzer's revival of the medieval and the early modern discussion of just and unjust wars addresses the dual aspects of the ethics of war. One, the justification of going to war. Two, the right conduct in the war. Aspects more widely known by their Latin terms jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Michael is not the only one who addresses those issues in the secular form. But he is the one who set the agenda for dealing with them. Setting the agenda does not mean making others agree with you. It means becoming the point of reference for all discussions that follow. Setting the agenda is a momentous as well a rare philosophical achievement. Michael's contribution does not end in reviving and shaping the ethics of wars. He presented a style of philosophy that makes extensive use of historical examples. His examples are not mere illustration, but rather true illuminations. Michael's immensely engaging style was important in making room for dealing with the ethics of war as a topic deserving a center stage in a moral and political philosophy. He did all this despite a great deal of public cynicism that has engulfed the aspiration of imposing moral laws on the conduct of war. When the cannons roar, the laws are silent, is an old expression of such cynicism. It is an expression of the mistrust of moral consideration in a situation in which is deeply immoral, like the situation of war. The inhospitable background for Michael's work was and still corrosive cynicism combined with pessimism about what selfish human beings can realistically achieve. And add to it the skepticism as to who is entitled, if at all, to decide about the morality of war. Michael's concrete style makes the reader relate to the reality of war without feeling subjugated to an annoying didactic preaching. My personal remedy for cynicism is different. It is the Cosa Nostra in Sicily, which for a long time did not include uninvolved family relatives in their blood feuds. The hardest of cynics look soft in comparison to those mobsters. Yet even those mobsters were able to make in real time the most important distinction in the morality of war, that between combatant and non-combatant. For a war to be just, said Aquinas, it requires to be mounted for a just cause. The requirement is shared by all who believe in the idea of just war. But for a cause to be just, it should be directed to the source of the wrong which the war claims to put right. In the case of the war in 1973, there were two sides fighting could be easily identified. The Israeli cause was clearly directed at the Egyptian army and vice versa. On October 7, however, Israel declared that its target was Hamas. But in a relatively short time, almost in no time, the just cause of Hamas as a target shifted to the very wrong cause of Gaza and the Gazan population as a target. The shift was made by equating Hamas with Gaza with horrible justifications. There are no innocent civilians in Gaza, they are all Hamas, etc. This included young children and the elderly. Mind you, innocent according to the rules of law means non-combatant. It has nothing to do with purity of heart. The shift in target from Hamas to the Gazan people drove our country away from a just war into the abyss of moral bankruptcy. There is a common fallacy in dealing with the justice of war. If two sides are going to war, each side advances its justification to be on the right and the other on the wrong. They cannot be right together and they cannot be wrong together. One of them has the right justification and the other the wrong one. This is a grave error. The justifications of two sides may be incompatible without being contradictory. To simplify matters, let me assume that you say that the table is green and I say that the table is red. It is not contradictory, for we both can be wrong. The same applies to war. We may both be on the wrong and we have no sound justification. Pacifism says that all sides that go to war are always wrong. Michael is not a pacifist. There are clear cases of just wars. Fighting Nazism is a glaring case in point. I'm with him on that. But pacifism does have a point. True wars are not always wrong, but just war in history are rare. This fact should be manifested by a strong presumption against going to war, a presumption that requires a stern and earnest effort to rebut it. The effort is expressed not so much by the known justification for going to war, such as self-defense, last resort, proportionality, or facing the real and imminent danger. What is needed is to act truthfully based on the right justification and not to use that justification as rationalization for a morally wrong motive. This is the condition of the right intention, and this vital condition is rarely satisfied. But rebutting is not enough. Conduct in war is vitally important too. Conduct that is marred by crimes, especially crimes against humanity, morally stains the side that perpetrates them, even if that side was initially justified in going to war. If I had enough world and time, I would have explained why I believe that jus in bello, namely judging the behavior in war, should be and should be the most crucial element in the moral theory of wars. It is more important than jus ad bellum, the justification of going to war. But lucky you, the time here is limited, and I should make room for the keynote speaker, Professor Michael Walzer, and then to the two respondents, each with a rich biography and not a mere academic CV. Allow me to skip both biography and CV and instead to adopt a rabbinical tradition of mentioning each by the book they are associated with. First to go is Professor Raef Zreik, the author of Kant on Time and Revolution. And last, but by no means least, Professor Yael Sternhell, the author of The Roads of War, the World of Movement in the Confederate South. So please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. So I am very happy to be with you today, and I'm very grateful to everyone who has spoken, to the organizers of this event, to Yuli, whose idea it was, to Shai, who brought it to the Van Leer. I also want to thank Orna Yoeli, who worked with me on the logistics of getting me here, getting us here, and making things easy, and she had to do it twice. And then I'm grateful, finally, to our daughters and their husbands, who told my wife and me that at 90, we were not allowed to come to Israel without their help. And so we are here with their help, and they are here too. I want to thank Avishai introduction. Particularly, I want to thank him for saying very clearly what I will say coming from New York, with a little more, but I hope not too more, diffidence. I think that this is somewhere around the 45th visit to Israel. And I want to begin today by remembering one visit roughly 42 years ago. I came to Israel in 1983 for a semester with a daughter who was here in high school to teach a course at Hebrew University on war and morality. The Just and Unjust Wars was soon to appear in Hebrew. My students included some people who are here today, and I learned something very important that year. The students in my class knew a lot about war, a lot more about war than their teacher. Remembering that lesson, I have worried a lot about what to say today. I want to tell you what this just war theorist thinks about the Gaza war, and I want to acknowledge in advance that you know more about this war than I do, even though your government wants you to know less. We all know that at this critical moment, it is very important to have frank discussions, to talk frankly among ourselves about the war that Israel has fought and about the peace that we all need. The Palestinian people also need to talk frankly among themselves about Hamas's war and about the peace they need. But today I will focus just on Israel, on us. I've written about many different wars since the publication of Just and Unjust Wars, most often about Israel's wars, not out of some general interest, but because I have a deep commitment to the safety and well-being of the state of Israel. Your state, not quite mine, since I am a figure of ambivalence, a diaspora Zionist, who has made only what my friend Shlomo Avineri once called Chetzi Aliyah. I responded to 7 October with shock and fury, though certainly not at the levels reached here. I recognized the criminality of the attack. That was easy, and I tried to understand the trauma it produced here in Israel. I thought a military response was just and necessary. I also thought that the hostages had to be brought home for national reasons and for specifically Jewish reasons. The redemption of captives is a diaspora commitment inherited by the state. Indeed, it's one reason for having a state. These two, war and redemption, turned out to sit uneasily together. And I believe, as I suspect many of you do, that at particular moments, your government got the priorities wrong, terribly wrong. It was necessary to oppose the very early calls for a ceasefire, which would have represented a victory for Hamas. But at some point, military success, even limited success, opened possibilities that should have been welcomed, again, for national reasons and for Jewish reasons. Early on, writing and talking about the war, I emphasized Hamas's responsibility, not only for 7 October. I argued against commentators, writers in the US who quickly condemned that day's attack, and then, having gotten that out of the way, wrote about the war as if Hamas was entirely absent from it. There was only one agent in the field, the IDF. What needed and still needs to be said is that Hamas designed and fought a war that Israel could not respond to even had it responded in the best possible way, without killing civilians, destroying homes, and displacing inhabitants. This is a common feature of asymmetric war, wars that are fought between a high-tech army and a low or lower-tech insurgency. The insurgents fight from civilian cover, and the army does most of the killing. But Hamas was unusually good, actually masterful, at civilian cover. Hamas fighters were deeply embedded in the civilian cities, and an underground city, a military city, was constructed for which the civilian cities were a collective human shield. I wrote a lot about the tunnels, which were much more than tunnels. They represented something unprecedented in military history. And this doubled use of civilian cover above and below set a trap. It's one version of what I call the asymmetry trap. And Israel had, I suppose, no choice but to walk into it. The death and destruction that followed was rightly recognized as part of Hamas's design. But when you walk into a trap, you have to think very carefully about how to get out. You can try to blast your way out, which was, I think, the government's response. Or you can look to transform the trap in ways that open options not only for military action, but also for diplomacy, also for politics, as some IDF officers and some American advisors recommended. Even in the trap, there were choices to make for the Israeli government, for the IDF, for particular army units and individual soldiers in the field. Sitting in New York, many of those choices were invisible to me. I can't judge them, but many were not invisible. Israeli citizens here and also friends abroad recognized signs of moral trouble, signs that needed to be addressed but were not addressed. The trauma of 7 October produced a rhetoric of revenge and demands for indiscriminate killing, which some of the speakers and Israeli leaders probably didn't mean to be taken seriously, but some certainly did. It produced the awful videos posted on social media by soldiers boasting of their private revenge and their own war crimes. Horribly visible to see, no doubt the work of a minority, but worryingly indicative of a loss of IDF discipline. And as if covered by the fury of the war in Gaza, settler violence on the West Bank steadily intensified, reaching finally, in these very days, into a pogrom, with the police and army looking on. And there were believable reports of the abuse and humiliation of captured Hamas fighters. The refusal to allow Red Cross visitors was wrong, I think, even if it was meant to press Hamas to allow visitors to the hostages. Everyone knew that wouldn't work, given what we knew about Hamas. Then came the charges by former IDF soldiers, widely reported in the United States, that the previously enforced ratio of acceptable civilian deaths in military operations had been abandoned or radically revised. I can't say anything about the internal debates that must have gone on, only that in the most recent airstrikes earlier this year, and perhaps in some before that, the old ratio does not seem to figure at all. The raids seem to be intended to make Gaza uninhabitable, at least by its present inhabitants. But I want to talk more particularly about sieges, the siege that was called for early on by prominent figures in Israel. It was an on and off siege, intermittent, incomplete, but still a significant part of the Israeli war effort. In the final reckoning, this may turn out to be the crucial issue. What responsibility did Israel have for the well-being, the health and nutrition of the people of Gaza after 7 October? After that attack, many Israelis and diaspora Jews also thought that the right answer was no responsibility at all. There were no civilians here, only enemies, combatants in spirit or in fact, who celebrated 7 October. That judgment was wrong. Consider, you've already heard about Maimonides on sieges. I'm going to make a different argument. Consider the basic structure of a siege. You surround a city, you cut off supplies, and then you sit and wait. The inhabitants of the city get hungry. They press the rulers of the city, and the rulers, often in military history, the rulers of the city appeal for negotiations. They offer to pay tribute, they surrender. But that story assumes a moral or political connection between the city's inhabitants and the city's rulers. No such connection exists between Hamas and the people of Gaza, and every Israeli decision maker knew that. It was part of our collective description of and condemnation of Hamas. Its leaders want to kill Jews, but they also want Jews to kill Palestinians. The large number of deaths in Gaza is again part of their design. And that's why the siege was a political mistake, and more important, a moral wrong, inflicting suffering that could not be described as militarily necessary, could not be described even as militarily profitable. It may seem odd to say this, but in asymmetric wars, the well-being of the civilian population is the responsibility of the high-tech army that is killing many of those same civilians. First, because the death and suffering of civilians is an asset for the other side. This was true for the Americans in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, where an American colonel in 2010 was quoted as saying, "The more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war." So there is a strategic argument here, but there's also a moral argument, a very simple one. Anyone causing destruction, even justly causing destruction, must help the innocent victims of destruction if they can, and it was clear from early on that Israel could. Hamas might benefit by stealing some part of the food, medicine, fuel that Israel intermittently provided. It benefited more from the suffering the siege produced. In truth, Israel managed the siege in a way that meant, and seemed from far away, intended to mean that there would be no end to the suffering, no sustained relief until a total victory. A victory that was never morally possible, probably not strategically possible, and that no one really believed in. I want to come back to the ceasefire issues. The war was necessary, but wars must have an end in view. Many Israelis have insisted on this point, as have many American friends of Israel. Your government consistently refused to commit itself to any substantive end, except maybe earlier this year to the reoccupation of the Gaza Strip and the transfer of all or many of its inhabitants. But there was a better end promoted by some Israelis and by the previous and maybe the current American government. And here let me speak as an American who voted for and admired Joe Biden. I can't report on his physical infirmities, but on October 8th, with mental and moral clarity and with firmness, he stood up for Israel and the Jews as no American president has ever done. From the aircraft carriers he sent to the Mediterranean, to the coalition his people assembled to defend Israel against Iranian missiles, he was a friend, a good friend. And he, with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, had an end in view, a plan to end the war urged upon the Israeli government at least a year before Trump's imitation of the same plan. I am sure that many of you here today supported that plan. It involved a permanent ceasefire, the return of the hostages, and a government for Gaza fronted by a reformed Palestine Authority, backed by Arab states and maybe by NATO also, excluding Hamas. But all this depended, especially the cooperation of the Arab states, all this depended on an Israeli commitment to live side by side with a Palestinian state. Not tomorrow, down the road, and with important qualifications of that state's sovereignty. But this your government would not, could not accept. The fate of the hostages, human suffering in Gaza, do not seem to have figured in the rejection of the Biden plan, the breaking of the ceasefire, and the resumption of the war. Biden could not stop the war. Trump did that and also brought back the remaining hostages. His 20 points are, as I've said, much like the Biden plan, and I think, though I am anxiously unsure, that Trump and his people recognize that peace requires an Israeli government that accepts the maxim, after war comes coexistence. I recognize that the Palestinians also have to accept that same maxim. I hope, I'm not sure I believe, I hope Trump understands both those requirements. Where am I? Perhaps this is the most important thing that a just war theorist can say. Once there was a political way to defeat Hamas and to free the hostages, the war became unjust. The effort to win it when there was no way to win without destroying Gaza and driving out all or most of its people, the effort to win it was a criminal effort. Of course, the Biden plan was imperfect, and so is Trump's 20 points. There were and are risks involved. Policing Gaza after the ceasefire, would not have been easy a year ago, and isn't easy. We're not sure it's possible today. Still, the continuation of the fight against Hamas by other means, by political means, once it was possible, was and is morally necessary. I greatly admire the conviction and courage of the Israeli civilians and soldiers who said that explicitly, out loud. I admire the people who took to the streets to defend the hostages, to demand an end to the war. I like to think that had I been here, I would have protested with them. I admire the Israelis in the streets today, demanding a commission of inquiry. I admire the Israelis who go to the West Bank to defend civilian life against settler thugs. Once the war is actually over, it will require even greater conviction and courage to undertake the moral reckoning that is necessary. The war was, no doubt, as a friend of mine here today has said, the war was a co-production. I have emphasized that. But the people of Israel must recognize the role of your government and army in the carnage of Gaza and the daily cruelties on the West Bank. Recognize also, of course, the bravery of your soldiers facing the extraordinary difficulties of asymmetric warfare. Recognize also the solidarity and resilience of your society. Pride, yes, but also guilt for the wrongs done in your name. There will be an international reckoning, which won't be entirely wrong, but it will be radically one-sided, hypocritical, and often dishonest. And that's why it is so important for Israel's future, for all of us, that you make the reckoning yourselves. Please get it right. Thank you.
Well, I think that we had a very exhausting day, a joyful one, but an exhausting one. So all the questions that you have, you can send in emails. And now you can sing Hatikva or whatever. And see you next time. Wait.
That's fine. I'm happy to go to dinner.
No, Michael ended in such a way that, with such a crescendo that I forgot. Sorry, I'm really sorry.
So I'd like to speak about a question beyond the scope of Michael's classic explication of just and unjust wars. I do this not because I want to avoid the question of the Gaza war as a just war. Everyone else has said it, but I want to be on record saying it too. The war has turned out to be such an utter moral catastrophe for us in Israel that the debate seems moot at this point. Even if there was a just cause for a military response following the horrifying Hamas attack of October 7th, and the goal of dismantling Hamas as a governing force in Gaza made sense even to those of us who remain staunchly on the left, a dying breed in this country, if not in this room. The way in which Israel has conducted the war, particularly in its second year, obliterates its claim to be fighting a just war. The jus ad bellum has been entirely overshadowed by the jus in bello. In this company, the gruesome details are known to all. Michael has recounted some of them. I won't rehash them. They will haunt us for the rest of our lives. But now active fighting has supposedly ended. So what's next? Dissent magazine runs a piece by Michael from the winter of 2004, as America's war in Iraq seemed to be winding down. Under the title of Just and Unjust Occupations, Michael asked whether there could be such a thing as a just post-war to an unjust war. And he says, we have to be able to argue about aftermaths as if this were a new argument, because though it often isn't, it might be. A just aftermath, per Michael, rests on the principles of democratic political theory: self-determination, popular legitimacy, civil rights, and the idea of a common good. We want wars to end with governments in power in the defeated states that are chosen by the people they rule, or at least recognized by them as legitimate, and that are visibly committed to the welfare of those same people, all of them. We want minorities protected against persecution, neighboring states protected against aggression, the poorest of the people protected against destitution and starvation. Michael is right. The post-war is an opportunity to start from scratch. Even if the same military force that had won the war is the one undertaking the work of occupation, it is faced with different demands and challenges, often radically so. As the task at hand shifts from conquering and killing to managing and caring, any army and any state can perform their roles as efficiently and fairly as possible. Moreover, the end of war, the moment the guns more or less fall silent, is often suffused with relief and joy, which can be harnessed to establish a level of trust between occupiers and the occupied in service of lasting peace. The question of whether post-war justice can be attained, even if the war that has followed was unjust, is very much worth pondering, and Michael is very persuasive in arguing that it can be. But as a historian, I have a different way of thinking about the relationship between justice in war and justice after the war. I will start by using an example from my day job as a historian of 19th century America, which offers some lessons, I feel, for the current moment. The American Civil War was, generally speaking, a just war. It broke out because of a political stalemate over the future of the United States as a slaveholding republic and resulted in one of the greatest acts of justice in history, the emancipation of 4 million enslaved men, women, and children who had been held in brutal bondage with no prospect of ever attaining their freedom, either through a political process or through rebellion. While the war didn't break out over the immediate fate of slavery in the United States, but over its future, it was still a contest that pitted the federal government against a breakaway faction that sought to establish an independent nation for the sole purpose of ensuring the perpetuity and expansion of human bondage. The Civil War was also conducted more or less justly, especially compared to later conflicts on the same scale. Though historians in recent years have uncovered a great deal of evidence revealing enormous cruelty inflicted by numerous actors and have moved to characterizing the process of wartime emancipation as a humanitarian crisis, in comparison to future wars, it was still a rather tame conflict in which the conventions of warfare, formalized halfway through by the legal scholar Francis Leer into what would be known as General Order 100, the Union Army's Code of War, these rules were generally observed in principle as well as in practice. And so we have here a war fought against one of the worst causes in history by armies that managed to fight it without resorting to the worst forms of barbarism. This being the case, it would have been reasonable to assume that the United States, having conquered the defeated Confederate States of America, would be able to operate with some measure of justice as it transitioned into the post-war. Yet as soon as the Confederacy surrendered, it became obvious that the United States was both unwilling and incapable of making real the promise of freedom for American slaves, which in these particular circumstances is what justice would have actually meant. While the emancipation of Southern slaves was considered a positive outcome because it stripped slaveholders of the source of their wealth and punished them for dragging the country into war, this was as far as the great majority of white Americans were willing to go in the 1860s. What would happen to 4 million persons who were no longer enslaved but were devoid of property beyond clothes on their back? How were they supposed to support themselves? Who would protect their lives now that they had been turned from valuable property into a thorn in the side of their former enslavers, representing by their very being both investment lost and honor crushed? These were hard questions which Americans, by and large, were uninterested in answering. Therefore, it is unsurprising that the post-war order was characterized by anything but justice. Those who had been freed were murdered, raped, beaten, tossed out of their homes, denied their wages, or left to die by the roadsides. We have no exact figures, only a wealth of anecdotal evidence, since no official record was made of the casual violence inflicted on innumerable freed people. The United States Army, composed largely of volunteers eager to go home, was quickly demobilized, leaving a minuscule force that at times amounted to 17,000 men to police a territory the size of Western Europe. Within a year of the war's end, the citizenry of the victorious states had moved on, having grown tired of the South and the problem of race relations. Its elected officials followed suit, and by 1867, 2 years after the end of the war, supporters of equal rights for African Americans were losing elections left and right. As the decade came to a close, a new social order was starting to take hold, one that resembled slavery more than freedom. That social order would remain in place for another century. The post-war made clear that while the war resulted in the destruction of Southern slavery, support for emancipation was shallowed and limited by nearly universal suspicion and hostility towards the freed, with staunch resistance to the possibility of Black people of any legal status enjoying equal rights in the United States. In the end, the white men had fought each other for 4 long years in increasingly bitter battles. They shared an entrenched sense of racial solidarity and cultural affinity, which led to the quick restoration of the old order and to minimal efforts on the side of the federal government on behalf of those who had been transformed from property to person and now needed the protection of the state. In this case, as well as in others, the just or unjust character of the post-war reveals a great deal about the war that had just ended and the societies that fought it. War is a time of aberrations and exceptions, almost a moment of temporary insanity, when anything is possible, the greatest acts of cruelty, but also tremendous acts of kindness. Active warfare forces individuals and societies to step out of old rhythms and routines. The post-war, in contrast, reintroduces inertia as the overriding principle governing day-to-day life. There are less aberrations and more consistency. Which brings me back to the current war. How many times have you heard from Israeli Jews while active fighting was taking place? I'm sorry for the suffering of women and children in Gaza, but if Hamas would only lay down its arms, if the hostages would only be released. Well, now, Hamas has laid down its arms, at least as much as can be expected, and the hostages, at least those who survived our government's callous disregard for their lives, have been released. And yet Israelis are largely as oblivious as ever to the suffering of Palestinian civilians, including of young children. While some have regained their critical faculties, many remain as blindly vengeful as they were in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. Examples are so many, it is hard to pick the most salient ones. Haaretz correspondent Shirin Falach-Sab describes Gazans as living in the Stone Age. A reservist I met this weekend after having returned from a tour of duty inside the Yellow Zone summarized his time there. This is what hell must look like. 349 Gazans, this was yesterday, so the number may be different today, have died since the ceasefire was declared and 900 were wounded. According to Nir Hasson, the Gazan healthcare system, largely destroyed during the war, still suffers from such acute shortages, it is basically unable to treat those needing care. Medication has gone bad, waiting for months to be delivered, so anesthesia and surgery doesn't work. In Gazan healthcare facilities, after the ceasefire, all that awaits patients, per Hasson, is suffering upon suffering. If you are willing to pay attention, each day brings its own litany of horror stories of a post-war in which civilians are seen just as disposable as they did during wartime. Looking beyond the hellscape that is everyday life in Gaza, the post-war is profoundly unjust in a deeper way, of course. It does not seem to be providing any hope for peace or justice for Palestinians after the destruction of Gaza. Negotiations for any long-term settlement have stalled. The Trump administration has predictably lost interest, and much like the Northern public in the 1860s, has just moved on. And the Israeli government seems to have regained its ability to manhandle other parties and stave off pressure to make any concessions. Meanwhile, it controls more than 50% of Gaza. One might argue that for Israelis there is no post-war, since the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains active and the existential threat they are feeling remains as pertinent as it ever has. But life in Israel does go on. People plan vacations and worry about school or work. The euphoria of that Monday when the ceasefire went into effect may have subsided, Israelis live their lives even as the government and the army under its orders continue to enforce a regime of enormous cruelty towards the other side. None of Michael's dictates for a just occupation has materialized in Gaza. Specifically, the poor, which is basically everyone, are not protected against starvation and destitution, and Israel's resistance to any discussion of a post-war order means that there is no effective government, at least not one that is recognized by other actors, and certainly not one that is committed to the welfare of its citizens. Israel has not just destroyed Gaza, it is now preventing its reconstruction. For me, this non-reconstruction with a lowercase r is as telling as the reconstruction with an uppercase r, about which I spoke. Clearly, there is no intrinsic connection between these two post-wars, except for in my own mind. Yet despite being profoundly different, they share one striking similarity, which I think might have broader implications. Both here and there, the nature of the post-war moment provides clarity on the nature of the war and the people who fought it. In the Reconstruction South, the post-war brought into sharp relief the stringent limitations on Black freedom, or it revealed how white people really felt about Black people. In non-Reconstruction Israel-Palestine, the post-war reveals the extent to which the destruction of Gaza and the suffering inflicted on its people were not derived from military necessity, a tool for defeat of Hamas, but are considered the fate that Gazan deserved, the condition they ought to live in for the foreseeable future. The post-war tells us who we are. This is who we are.
I'd like to thank our trio. In their best moments, they were even better, the famous three tenors. So thank you, and thank you for the whole day, those who stuck for the whole day in all the meetings, and those who came for this meeting. I think that it was an occasion and a very satisfying one, and it's all due to our illustrious Michael Walzer. So please join.